Hello, Herman here with a new video in the ClearPass workshop series where we will build a ClearPass deployment from scratch and integrate with wired, wireless, Active Directory and much more. So in the previous video we were able to authenticate our clients and we got both machine authenticated and we were able to get a user authentication. In this video we will be introducing the Aruba user roles which are applied on the infrastructure, so the instant AP in our case, and we are introducing ClearPass roles, which are nothing less than labels or tags during the ClearPass authentication. It's important because these are both called roles, but as mentioned, the user roles that are applied on the Aruba Instant AP, they are sent back as a radius VSA, and they control the firewall access for the client. They can control which applications can be used, quality of service, captive portals, where on the other side, if we have the ClearPass roles, it's just a label that's applied. We can use that for enforcement. We'll come to that later on. Let's have a look at the client. We are authenticated as an admin, and we are authenticated to the Airheads Corp SSID. And we can see the authentications in the ClearPass Policy Manager as well. That's where we ended at the previous video. So let's go now in our Instant AP. We see our client is connected, and here under configuration security we can create new roles. So these are the Aruba Instant user roles. You can see there is a role already for the Airheads Corp, which is the SSID name, and for the management SSID. So these are built in by default, and we can add and create new roles. So let's first create a role for our employee user. So you can see the access rules are allowed and I think for an employee that's correct. Let's create another role. So let's create the machine role, so for the machine authenticated users. And for the machine, of course, we want to allow all communication as well. Let's create another one for the contractors. So our contractors, I think it's a good idea to prevent them accessing our intranet server because they have nothing to do on the internal network. So what we can do is we can create a rule here that will prohibit access to the intranet site, which is this specific IP address. Let's put that action on deny and move the rule up before the allow all. So that's good. Then let's finish this up with two other roles. So one will be for our admins and the other for the help desk. So these are the different roles that I have in my AD as user groups. So this is what we need to do on the Instant AP. And as mentioned, in a production scenario, this can be much more granular than it's here with basically allowing everything just for the contractor. We are blocking traffic to the intranet side. So now we need to apply this VSA, and we can do that by going into our service. So again, this is our service. We had the authentication against the AD. We're using EPTLS as mentioned. We did not touch the role mapping. So this is the ClearPass role mapping that we mentioned. So it's just labels. And in the enforcement, we did select the simple allow access policy, which just provided an allow and gave all the access to the network. What we are going to do now is that we need to create enforcement profiles. So in the enforcement profiles, we can return attributes like the Aruba user role attributes as a radius vendor specific attribute or VSA. So let's add one. So the default Aruba radius enforcement is okay. Now we type our name. And again, I prefer to prepend the role name with WS so we know it's for the workshop. And later on we can filter on it as well. So let's call this WS employee. And having a good description always helps. So later on you will be happy that you added the descriptions. Now we go into the attributes, and there you have a placeholder already where you can just type in the name. So this name employee lowercase, that's the same as we had as the user role in the Instant AP. So these must match. So when this enforcement profile is issued, at that point you will get the VSA Aruba user role equals employee, and that will be sent to the AP, which then should enforce that specific user role. And as you can see, we can filter on this name, so we can just see the one starting with WS. So let's immediately create the VSAs for the other types of access as well. So let me create the admin one. And as you can see, it's WS admin. And the role is admin lowercase. That's how we configured it on the instant AP. Let's create one for the machine authentication. And we can copy rules as well. So if you think it's easier to just copy it and change it, you can just copy one of the enforcement profiles and then adjust it so it will match what you need to have. So sometimes it's easier to type them from scratch, and other times it's easier to do a copy and then change it. So now we only need to have the help desk role. Let's add that one. And there we are. We have 5 different enforcement profiles, which each of it will return the Aruba user role that has been configured in the instant AP. So now we need to apply it, and we do that through a enforcement policy, which we can either create through enforcement policies, or we can create them through the service, which is what I prefer, because at that point you know exactly which service is using which enforcement, so it's easier to find the right one. So again here, let's create the enforcement policy and let's prepend it as well with WS. And we can give it a name, so this will be the enforcement policy for Aruba Instant. And let's call it 1x. So this is specifically for Aruba Instant.1x, which will use Aruba user roles returned as the vendor specific attributes. Then we need to select a default profile, and I typically use the deny access profile as the default. So if during the enforcement policy we miss something and the default is selected, it's a denial, so the user won't get any access, and that's better than having an maybe open access where you have additional risks. In the enforcement policy, we create rules, and what we can do is we can check in our Aruba Lab AD if the groups equals the workshop users. So this is the name of the group in the Active Directory where the users are in. So you can either use groups equals, or you can member of contains. Both will work. I have a preference for the groups equals. I will show you later on why I do prefer that. If the Aruba Lab AD group equals workshop users, we select which profile is returned, and let's return the employee profile for that. So users in the workshop users group in AD will get returned the employee enforcement profile, which will send the employee VSA user role to the instant AP. So let's save this, and don't forget to apply the newly created enforcement policy. And let's save. Now let's have a look in our client. So let's sign off first. We were logged in as admin1. So let's sign in now as user1, which is a user that is in the workshop users group. So we are signed in. Let's have a look in ClearPass. And let's go back to Access Tracker. We can see we have a successful authentication, and if we click on it, we can see that we are TLS authenticated against the Aruba Lab AD, and we can see the enforcement profile WS employee was returned. And if we now check on the instant AP, we had to save these changes. Let's do that. If we check the client lists, if all is good, we should see that we have the role employee. So we see the username and we can see the role employee. So at least that worked. And let's check back in the Access Tracker. And what you can see in the Access Tracker as well is that we have a reject now for the machine authentication. And that is because in our enforcement policy, we had the default of a deny access profile. And because we did not create any rule that allows machine authentication, that's the reason why we get a deny access on there as well. Let's get to the ClearPass roles. You've seen that in the enforcement we can check group membership and return enforcement profiles. However, in many times you need to repetitively do the logics like checking group membership, and that's where ClearPass roles can be used for. What you can do in the role mapping is you can check the group membership and then apply an internal label or tag or what's called a ClearPass role. and then in the enforcement you just check if that tag or role is applied and return the correct enforcement profile. This will be handy at least if you have multiple services, for example for wired and wireless, because the enforcement might be different, but the role determination, who is in what group and should be applied what role on the network, that will be the same across all the platforms. Let's configure that. So first we need to go into the identity and the roles, and there we create our different roles. So as you can see, it's just a name and a description, just that. So it's a label, it doesn't do anything. And let's create for all the 5 different roles that we have a role in ClearPass as well. And in order to get these roles applied, we need to have a role mapping. And the role mapping is again either directly through the menu available, or you can go into the service. And I prefer to go through the service. So here in the role mapping, we create a new role mapping. And there we need to give it a name. And as this is reused, I don't give it the name instant. But let's call it identity role mapping 1x. So role mapping for AD users which are using .1x. So we can reuse this role mapping later on for wired and other methods. As you can see, we need to have a default role as well, and we can select one from the default. Now let's create a new one. So let's create WS no role, so we know if we see that role that there was no proper role mapping. And then we have the role mapping rules. First of all, you can have multiple rules, and you can select if you want to have the first match or you want to have the select all matches. In general, as a best practice, you will find that for role mapping you will always have the select all matches, so you can collect multiple ClearPass roles. And for the enforcement policy later on, you will have a first match. So that works best in most cases. And here we can then in the mapping rules, we can create something similar that we did in the enforcement policy. So if the AD group equals workshop admins, we will apply the admin role. So let's have a look in my AD for the exact group names, because I always forget it and these must match exactly. So if we scroll down, there we are. So workshop admins, contractors, help desk, users. So these are the 4 user groups that I have for my different users. So let's create those. This one for the contractors, and we will just, based on the group membership of workshop contractors, we will apply the role WS contractors in ClearPass. And as well here we can copy our rules if we want. So create a few copies of it, edit. So for our users, that will be the employees. You can see the AD group can be completely different than the role name that you have as well. The role name in ClearPass can be different from the role that we return in the vendor specific attributes. So this one for the help desk. And the last one for the machine authenticated. Oh yeah, that will not work because the machine authenticated is automatically applied. We will use that in the enforcement policy. So let's remove this one. So here we can see our 4 different groups mapping to 4 different roles, and we have select all matches. So if a user is member of 2 groups, they will get both of the roles in ClearPass. So let's go next and save. And now we can apply this role mapping policy. And now we need to change our enforcement policy as well, because we don't want to check group membership in the enforcement policies. We now have our role mapping for that. So we need to change it. And for the check, we take tips. And tips, for those who are wondering, that's the old name of the ClearPass product before it was called ClearPass. Then we check role equals and then WS employee in this example. And then we will return the return attribute WS employee. And this allows us to, for example, if we have a wired solution, we can have the same logics in the enforcement policy. although we don't return the Aruba user role, but we can, for example, return a VLAN or something else. And then the whole logics of finding out who is part of which role, that's still in the role mapping, but the enforcement will be different for each type of the device. So it looks a bit additional work, and at this point it is, but later on you will see that it's worth investing in it. So let's change our other rules. And there we go. So employee admin. Oh, I see I have twice the admin. I will change that later on. And for the last one, I said that for the machine authentication, there is a built-in role, which is called machine authentication between square brackets. So there you see. So now we can save this enforcement. So you can see the enforcement policy is really simple. Just checking if this role, then return that VSA, that Aruba user role to the instant AP. So let's save that. Now it's active. And now let's have a look in our client, what happens. So we're signing out. So now we should be machine authenticated. Well, let's first log in as user again, just to see if the logics that we had before, if that still works. Let's go to Access Tracker. And in the Access Tracker, first of all, we see the machine authentication, which was successful again, because now we have a mapping for that. So let's here under Edit, we can add the enforcement profile as well, so it's shown in the table. And let's remove the server name, because that's not so useful at this point. So now you can see we have an additional column, and we can see the machine enforcement was, first the employee was done, then the machine, and when we signed in again, we had, because we had the machine authenticated default role, we got this machine enforcement profile, which returned the machine role to the instant AP, and after that, when we signed in, it switched to user authentication, and we can see we had the role WS employee. So that's another benefit of using role mappings. You can see in the Access Tracker which roles are assigned, and that makes it easier for troubleshooting. So let's have a look again in our instant AP. If we now have our employee role assigned, and yes, you can see, we have the employee role assigned. Let's first check if we can access our intranet. So as an employee, we have full access, so we should be able to reach the intranet, and that works. So now let's sign off. And at this point, we should have the machine role. Yeah, there we go. We have the machine role. And let's now sign in as the contractor. Yeah, there we go. We see that we have authenticated as contractor. And we have the authentication done there, and there we have the contractor role in ClearPass, and we are returning the contractor enforcement as well, which should send the Aruba user role contractor in a lowercase, which we created on the instant AP and which does not have access to our intranet. So let's check. And as you can see, we see a timeout. We are not able to reach our intranet server, which is completely expected because the contractor role on the instant AP, it blocks access to our intranet server. Let me show you one more thing. So here under the input, the authorization attributes, I mentioned the thing about groups and the member of. So you can see groups, it's the exact name of the group as it is in AD. With member of, it's the LDAP kind string, so common name equals workshop contractors. And if you are checking the groups, then you can do equals. If you have multiple groups, so users that are part of multiple groups, you can just check if they are part of the workshop contractors. And if they are also member of another group, then it will still match with groups equals contractor. With the member of, you should always have contains. And it's a concatenation of all the member of properties. And that can be a very long string, and it may be very hard with contains in that long string to get an exact map on the groups, especially if you are using the name of the company both in the domain name and in the group's names, for example. So there are many reasons to use the groups equals versus the member of. To summarize, we did a lot in this workshop. We discussed the Aruba instant user roles, which are basically firewall roles applied and configured on the instant AP. By the way, they can be sent from the ClearPass as well. Then it's called downloadable user roles, and there's another video on how to use downloadable user roles for instant on the channel. I'll put a link on screen now. And for switches, it's even more common to do downloadable user roles. We'll get to that point when we reach the wired section of this workshop. On the other hand, we have the ClearPass roles, and as mentioned, these are just tags. So you can use them to do, for example, group membership checking, or you can do all kinds of additional things if it's a specific device and so on. And then you can reuse that role mapping across different services. So these are completely different things. Both are called roles, but these are completely separate, completely different. If you read ClearPass role, just think tags, label, and nothing else. So thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and comment.